Professor Siddhartha Bhattacharya will be taking care of the topic quantum meta-heuristic applications to automatic clustering. Sir, may I now invite you to take the session, sir, please.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Is the screen visible?
Yes, yes, sir, it is visible.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful FDP, which is being organized by the Department of IT, Tripura University. And the organizers are very well known to me, very close to me. They're very close to me. In fact, they have invited me earlier also. In fact, way back in 2019, I visited university, beautiful university. Anyway, so you see, this is a very good topic. In fact, good topic in the sense very upcoming technology in the form of quantum computing, and people here and there are talking about quantum computing like anything. But we have to be very careful about this because even if you think of having a quantum computer in the near future, although several companies like Microsoft and Google and all these companies have already come up with some, they are claiming that they have come up with a quantum computer and they are outsourcing. In fact, they are putting outsourcing the cloud services to quantum computing. But then the problem is that with these quantum computers, perhaps you have been already informed during the introductory classes that the technology is far from being realizable. That means you cannot just think of having a desktop quantum computer in the near future. Maybe another 10 years from now, the technology will mature. The problem is that the more important problem is that although the technology is moving at a rapid pace with several innovations coming up, but the physics has not yet matured. So there is the main problem over there. Anyway, just having an idea of that entire technology which is likely to come in the near future is quite relevant in this present time. So I'll be dealing with this topic today, which is quantum meta-heuristics applications to automatic clustering. So you know meta-heuristics, that means these are some heuristical search techniques which are used to explore the search space and feature space and try to come up with an optimum solution. Not generally optimum, but near optimum solution. So generally speaking, these meta-heuristics have been found to be very robust in all engineering applications. However, the main limitations of this meta-heuristic is that they are very time consuming and time intensive. So you do not expect these algorithms to run in real time. So what is the way out? Way out is that people generally run these algorithms in offline mode and then they come up with optimized results and then they try to fit that in the real time applications. Be that as it may, this quantum materialistic is a novel idea, novel initiative in this direction, which has been taken way back about around 10 years from now. And people are working vociferously on this particular topic with the fact that several advantages you generally perceive when you just conjoin these quantum computing principles with the materialistic such techniques to come up with some quantum inspired or quantum materialistics as such, because these materialistics generally when you just conjoin these quantum computing principles, you generally get the advantages of quantum mechanical principles which help to reduce the time complexity to some extent, and that is why making them ready for at least some real-time applications, if not all. So we'll be dealing with this quantum materialistics part today with applications to automatic clustering. Now the clustering process, because the clustering itself is the grouping of segregation of data depending on some features. That means you are grouping together objects or similar objects and trying to just degroup dissimilar objects. So that is the main principle. But then in any clustering process, you require some prior information regarding the number of clusters where we are going to fit into the clustering algorithm. Maybe it K-means clustering or FC-means clustering or any other clustering algorithms, or say K-medoid. You require to give the value of the K, that is the number of clusters from the user. That means the user intervention is required. So this particular initiative or approach is trying to make the process automatic. That means you did not give any value of the number of clusters or did not know the number of clusters beforehand. So the system itself or the algorithm itself tries to find out automatically the number of clusters, and then they try to optimize the number of clusters and find out the optimum solution. So that is the beauty of this particular technique. But then the entire thing has been taken care of by the quantum materialistics. So we'll be discussing the entire approach with reference to both classical meteoristics and quantum meteoristics. Now, these classical meteoristics will be dealing with two algorithms as such, namely the particle swarm optimization and the differential evolution algorithms, which will be discussed and then followed by the quantum versions. So let us move forward. The agenda today will be some brief introduction to the classical meteoristics with reference to the two algorithms like PSO and DE, and then some ideas about clustering process already may be known to all of you. Then cluster validity indices, how a clustering process can be adjudged regarding their performance, whether a clustering process is good or bad, or the clusters we have generated is good or bad. That can be measured by some cluster validity indices. So we'll be discussing about that, and then based on these cluster validity indices, taking these cluster validity indices as the what I refer to as the objective functions, we will try to just find out an optimal solution to this problem, clustering problems, using both classical meteoristics and quantum meteoristics. So before moving forward, just see, because these are very simple ideas and very well-known ideas, just to have a brush up of the entire thing. Particle swarm optimization was discovered or developed by Dr. Rivartan and Dr. Kennedy in 1995, and it came out to be very efficient compared to the previous techniques which were there in place, like genetic algorithm and genetic programming and all the other algorithms which were developed by other scientists way back in 1960s. But then in 1995, they thought that how to use the social behavior of animals, like in the form of birds. In fact, you know that the birds try to move around in flocks and in search for food, and following that principle inspired by the behavior, they came up with this type of algorithm, and where it follows, this algorithm follows the different steps like this. First of all, they try to allocate different particles, or that means the population, because you know in any optimization algorithm or any meteoristic or evolutionary algorithm, you start with a population of random solutions, and in this particular case, these are referred to as particles. So you just prepare a population of particles, and then you update the particle position, because the ultimate objective is to move closer to the food or the object or the target in least time possible and least cost possible. So that is the objective. So what you do, you try to update the particle position according to its current position, current velocity, and the distance between the current position and the local base. That means all these things, you know, because the current position is already determined. When you just come up with some random particles, you know their position and velocity. So you assign them some random position, random velocities, and then you try to figure out the local base. That means the best values, or the best particle within the particular flock, and out of the entire flock, the global base. That means there are two best solutions. One is the local best and the global best, and also you compute the distance between the current position of the individual particles, and the local best, and the distance between this current position and the global base. So you see, if you just look, if this entire thing can be thought of like this: one bird is moving, another bird is also moving, another bird is also moving. So all these birds are moving in a particular direction. Maybe another bird is over here. So each and every particle tries to just compete with its neighbor, with all its neighbors. So this to find out the local best, which is the local best over here, and maybe the first one, the leading one is having the best fitness, so it will be the global best, say, suppose. So that will lead all the other birds in the particular direction of food. So that means this local best and the global best will ultimately decide whether the entire flock is moving in the right direction or not, based on the fitness. So that is the philosophy. So each and every time you update the position and the velocity of the particle, so that the fittest one becomes the global best and leads the entire flock in the right direction, because you are ultimately calculating the distance and updating the current position and current velocity as time goes on. So these are some typical equations which are being used for the updation of velocity and position. Velocity is updated with respect to some parameters, some coefficients, acceleration coefficients, and some random parameters. So these are quite well known. You can just consult any book and get the details about that, and also the position is updated like this. So this is all about. So this is the philosophy in which the entire procedure is repeated until you reach the target in less time, or rather with the least cost rather. So in this way, the entire process works. So they have put this entire thing as an algorithm and try to just apply to different engineering problems. And it was found that it is already well established that PSO is one of the best materialistic algorithms which are in use. Another one is the differential evolution. It is also a stochastic population-based optimization algorithm. It is also population-based. So it was introduced by Stone and Price in 1996. This is still later than the previous one. So this is also used for different optimization problems, both non-differentiable, non-continuous, non-linear, noisy, etc. All these type of domains, you can apply it quite well. So here also you see, so there is some initialization of population of random solutions, and then you go for some operators like mutation and recombination, similar to the genetic algorithm, to just introduce diversity in the solution, so that you get with the expectation that you always move to the get up with better solutions. Fine. And finally, a selection is there now. So since you are introducing diversity in this region, by using these operators in this part, so you are making the solution diverse and trying to explore the entire search space. Let us suppose that the search space is like this. You are trying to explore the entire search space to just part of the solutions, the current solutions, with the expectation that the new solutions which are coming up out of diversity may be better than the existing ones. And then finally, you go for selection. Selection means you just choose some of them, some of the best fit individuals or solutions. So that reduces diversity. So you are ultimately, what you are doing, you are introducing diversity over here, increasing diversity and reducing diversity. Both are doing. So you have to make a balance between the diversity, increasing of diversity and decreasing of diversity. So after that, you get the best fit individuals, some pool of best fit individuals, and then you just start all over again. Not initialization, you start all over again with the new population. Okay. So that actually comes over here. So this process is repeated simultaneously. You see this, because you have different operators like this, similar to the previous case where you have different coefficients like omega, K1, K2, all these things, they refer to acceleration coefficients. So these coefficients, as well as the parameters, mutation probability, recombination probability, and all these things, as well as the selection algorithm, these are quite heuristic, because these are not, there is no rule of thumb regarding the choice of a particular value of a parameter. So these are all heuristic in nature. What you have to do, you have to run the algorithm with particular set of parameters and find out how it is performing, and then you come up with the best possible setting of parameters which will give you the best outcome. So that is actually heuristic. The main issue of this particular algorithm is that it is all these algorithms are iterative in nature, and hence they call for some extensive computation. And moreover, there is no bound as to how many number of times you have to run the algorithm. Because if you think of running the algorithm, say 1,000 iterations or 1,000 generations, it may not be enough, because if you think that within 1,000 iterations we are achieving the convergence, but then it may happen if you run it 1,001 times, it may happen that you are again going to have a new maxima or new minima. So you never know when the algorithm will converge. So based on several factors, you generally try to stop the algorithm or terminate the algorithm. So the general practice is to run the algorithm for several runs, because since all these algorithms are random in nature, so each and every time you run it, say for the first time you run for 1,000 generations and you get some outcome, say some optima. And in the second instance, you again run it for another 1,000 times and get to second optima. So in this way, you run generally for say n number of times, and then what you do, for n number of times, you get n number of outcomes or optima, either a maximum or minima depending on the problem, and then what you do, you go for an average. So this is the general procedure we generally adopt, because you do not have any fixed rule as to how many number of times you can run the algorithm, or as to how many number of times, a number of generations the algorithm will run to converge. So these are several tricky issues over there, and that actually means that these are all time-intensive operations, time-intensive algorithms, not generally fit for real-time applications. So what's the way out? First of all, there is another interesting thing is that if you just try to fit these algorithms or try to come up with quantum versions of this algorithm, that is also very challenging thoroughfare, because because whenever you try, for example, if you just forget about the quantum computing, if you want to just embed this differential evolution algorithm on the PSO or any other evolution algorithm on a chip, it is next to impossible. Why? Because in a chip you only have some one-time operation. You cannot have any repetitive operation in a chip. In a VLSI technology, it does not support repetitive operation or iterative operation. So that is the main issue over here. So that is another challenge. So since it is already a challenge in a classical paradigm, so obviously the same thing will arrive when you go for a quantum computing or any quantum computing hardware. So generally speaking, what we do is generally running. So actually this algorithm, this materialistic algorithms, whenever you are trying to think of a quantum computing, all quantum computing solution using these evolutionary algorithms, it is not possible as of now. Maybe research is going on also, but then what you can do, you have to have a quasi-quantum. That means you can combine the classical. These algorithms can be run in the classical mode, and the other parts can be done in the quantum mode. Then you can just combine them together to get the final result. This is the way out. Anyway, let us move forward to have some discussion on clustering. Now, what is clustering? All of you know, a way of grouping together data samples that are similar in nature, some way depending on the features. So first of all, the condition said documents within a cluster should be similar, highly similar, and documents from different clusters should be highly similar. So inter-cluster similarity will be high and intra-cluster similarity will be low. The higher this one and lower this one, the better is the clustering. So these two factors are very important, quite important, and moreover, then it is a form of unsupervised learning. So they are generally just speak that it is unsupervised, but we do not. But there are different schools of thought. So you see there are three things we can just think of like this. It's actually self-supervised. One is supervised, where you have these, everything is supervised from outside. Another is self-supervised. Some part is supervised, and other parts are not. Another is purely unsupervised, but you do not have any intervention from outside, user intervention. So actually speaking, when you are thinking of a clustering algorithm, you need to provide the number of clusters from before that, from outside. So actually it is not unsupervised in the truest sense of the term. It may be a self-supervised algorithm, but then there are different schools of thought. So let us suppose for a time being that actually speaking, we are targeting something which is unsupervised, because our algorithm which is going to come up is not dependent on any key. You do not need to give any input. Only give the data, and the entire algorithm will find out the number of clusters and cluster the data accordingly. So it becomes an unsupervised technique and becomes a fully automated technique without no user intervention. And also it is a method of data exploration, because you explore the entire search space to find out the best possible solution. Do not know at which part of the entire feature space or the data space you will get the optimum solution. So you search the entire space or explore the entire space. So some simple examples. You see, this is a clustering where you see these clusters. This cluster is quite easy to just cluster, because these points are spread in such a fashion, so you can easily find just there is no overlap in between. But for example, if you have another point over here, so not here, sorry here, so then what will happen to this point? So it will form another different cluster. So that is the main issue. For example, let us suppose one point is here. What will happen? So it may either fall here or fall here. So that is the issue. So in case of for this purpose, clustering also has two incarnations in the form of hard clustering and soft clustering. In case of hard clustering, you only assign one single point to a single cluster. But in the case of soft clustering, any point can be in any cluster with some degree of membership, something like that, which is generally referred to as fuzzy clustering and all these things. So that's the issue over here. So some problems are generally there. So generally, if you just go for the little bit of mathematics is there, because I do not love mathematics at all. But then, for the sake of explanation, you have to have this mathematics over here. Let us data set is there, X comprising of n number of points. So n number of data points are there, n objects or n number of points. And what is the objective of a clustering algorithm? To divide the data set into p number of clusters. That means you are dividing the entire n number of points into p number of clusters, C1 to Cp. So if this is so you have to ensure that Ci must not be equal to 5. And nonsense. That is, no single cluster will be there where there is no data point. So that is not possible. So at least some data points will be there. In fact, in a cluster to have a valid cluster. The valid cluster should be at least contain some data points. With no data points, a cluster is not possible. Another is then cluster 1 and cluster 2, the intersection between them should be phi, null. But what we discussed earlier, that it should be null. Actually, if you just follow the hard clustering, it is generally null. And another thing is that union of all clusters will ultimately constitute this data set, because all the points will be there in all the clusters together. So if you just take a union, you will get the entire data set as such. So these are the three essential considerations for any clustering algorithm. Now, what is a good clustering? Given that we have done a clustering, there are several criteria which can be used to measure whether a clustering has been good or not. So generally speaking, quite simple. What we have discussed already earlier, that the intra-class similarity is high. That means the inter-class similarity is high. Means that means within a cluster, or within a class, the similarity will be high. Obviously, because similar objects will be grouped together, and the inter-class between two different classes, the similarity will be low. What we have discussed earlier. And the measured quality of a clustering depends on both the document representation and similarity measure. So you actually see how you measure the similarity or how you measure the performance depends on several factors. One is how you represent the data set, and also the which similarity measure you are using. So now these all already have discussed hard versus soft clustering. Hard versus soft clustering is each document belongs to only exactly one cluster. And more common and easier to do, fine, very good. But then there are several challenges, and soft clustering takes into account those problems. A document can belong to more than one cluster with some degree of membership, something like that. So there are some examples over there. For this example is quite important. Now, for example, if you want to put a pair of sneakers into two clusters, what you can do? A sneaker, for example, sneaker can be put in at least two. It can be put in both the clusters. Like it can be put in a cluster or class of sports apparel and also shoes. So a sneaker is both a sports apparel and also a shoe. But in the case of hard clustering, this type of categorization or clustering is not possible. But in case of soft clustering, you see sneaker can fit in both of these classes. So this is one quite useful example to understand. So this is actually what is referred to as soft clustering approach. Some examples where the clustering is generally used, like starting from biology to climate, everywhere. Where you have data, some data is there, some information is there which needs to be assessed, needs to be categorized. You require this information. For example, in marketing, so you see nowadays we have different mining technology, web mining, data mining. So you try to just figure out what a customer is, what is the choice of a customer, what is the likelihood of that a customer is going to buy a particular product. So, for example, if a customer goes into a storehouse, he or she buys for example, a jeans, and obviously based on his, and again he buys, say, for example, a t-shirt. So t-shirt plus jeans, this comes out to be one of the factors for that particular customer. The very next time when it comes in, if you go for purchasing a shirt, automatically the system will try to just recommend him or her that you can buy a jeans or a t-shirt. So all this, because they are clustering the choices of different human beings also in the marketing scenario, you can use them. For example, in land use, obviously, for demographic observations and earth observations, like hyperspectral images, you can also cluster. So all sorts of, I told you earlier that all sorts of engineering, as well as scientific, medical, and business applications are using this clustering process. And there are different major clustering approaches depending on their techniques. One partitioning approach, you partition the entire thing, partition the entire data set into different partitions and evaluate them by some criteria. Typical methods, very well-known methods, k-means, k-meteors, Clarence, etc. Hierarchical approach, instead of taking the entire data set, you just divide it into some different subspaces. And typical methods like this, so it is a top-down approach. And then density-based approach based on connectivity and density functions. Connectors to finding out the density of the objects, that means density of the different points based on the connectivity between them, and then you try to just cluster them together. And also some other techniques are there based on a granularity structure. So these are different well-known techniques, and obviously new techniques also coming up. And then finally, what is the cluster validity? That means how do you measure actually the performance of any clustering algorithm, whether a clustering algorithm has given you good outputs or not, or whether your algorithm, a new algorithm, for example, you have come up, whether it is now fit for, or rather it is competitive in the market, or it is comparative to any other algorithm. So that is why cluster validity or cluster validity index or indices. So you see how to evaluate the goodness of the cluster, that how they are good, whether they are good or bad, and how much they are good. But then it is subjective in nature actually, because to one person it may appear that a particular clustering result or outcome is good. To another person, it may happen that it is all not good. So that is why you see also that depends on the view, which particular view you are using for a cluster. That is why new technology already, or it is being developing, multi-view clustering, MVC, also coming up. So for example, I'm giving some small example. For example, a Chinese, say for example, you are listening to a Chinese song. Okay, Chinese song will have in fact, every song will have some words as well as some lyrics and some music, isn't it? Lyrics and music. And also another English song you was listening to, also having some lyrics and some music. So you can classify them. You see, for example, you can classify these two together either based on the lyrics or based on the music. So in which view, or based on which view you are clustering this, that depends. That is very vital, because it may happen that some notes of the music over here may be similar to here. So how can you just distinguish between them? They will be ultimately falling into the new. For example, the genre of this particular music and also of this particular music may be same, so they can be classified as the same. And then the lyrics, obviously, the English lyrics and the Chinese lyrics will be different, always different. So you can just group them. So you can cluster either based on the lyrics or the music. That is depending on the view. So you do not know whether whether the clustering based on lyrics is better or on music is better. So that is why multi-view clustering is a very new topic and a very well-researched topic nowadays. We are using this. Some techniques have already come up. Then why you are going to evaluate them? First of all, to avoid finding patterns in noise. So these are to compare the clustering algorithms, obviously, to compare different algorithms to see which algorithm is better than the other, to compare two set of clusters, whether the clusters have been clustered well or not, and also to compare two clusters. So different means ultimately for comparison purpose, you require these measures or cluster validity indices. Some examples are given there. We'll be discussing that. So when you are going to validate a cluster by means of this cluster validity index, so you have to just find out the clustering tendency. So which particular data element has a tendency to belong to which particular group. And then what you can do, you can compare the results of one analysis to another known result. For example, that is why I'm telling you, I told you that it is actually not, clustering is actually a supervised technique, not an unsupervised approach, because you already know that before, and that means the data set is labeled. That means a data set is labeled. That means, for example, data entry 1, 2, 3, these are all rows, columns, and this particular last column actually signifies that this particular row which will belong to which cluster. That means you know the label before that. So since you know the labels, and then if you just discard the label and then you try to cluster this data without knowing the label, then finally you come up with some labeling of this data. Then what do you compare with the known label? So there is always a scope that you know certain labels actually. So the label data actually you are using, that is why you can just compare to the externally known results for given class labels, for example. Or rather, you can see how the results of the cluster feed the data without reference to external information. That means it is purely, if you go for an unsupervised approach, you do not know the label, unlabeled data. So in those cases, what to do? You can only just use the data. No labeling is there. And also you can compare the results of two different sets of cluster analysis to determine which one is better. And finally, this is quite important, correct number of clusters that we are focusing on. You can also determine the correct number of clusters, which will give the best clustering result. So this will be focusing on. That means there is an option that we can find out the correct number of clusters, or optimum number of clusters. Now, in our sense, if you are using materialistic approaches for clustering, then obviously the optimum number of clusters is the correct number of clusters, which can be derived from these cluster validity index or out of cluster validation. The different types of measures are there. One is external index. I'll be not dealing with this in detail. Internal index, relative index. So different. You can just go into the literature and find out. Sometimes this also referred to the indices. That is why I was telling cluster validity index or indices, either criteria or indices. Okay. So some popular validity indices are there. One is the DAN index. sorry. One is a very, very well known and very popular. It was proposed by Dunn in 1974. So what it actually tries to do, it tries to identify compact and well separated. So you see both the features are there. One is the well separated means inter-cluster similarity will be low. That means the clusters will be the different clusters or different clusters will be well separated. And compact means all the data within the data points within a cluster will be very highly similar. They will be compact. So we're taking care of both the features. So this is the general formulation. VU is equal to mean of 42. They take one individual partitions x1, xi, xj, calculate the distance, and then you try to find out the maximum of all the distances. So different types of distances you can do. Either you can go for Euclidean distance or Manhattan distance, any type of distance you can use. So what actually you do, what is the objective is that you have to maximize V. That means the maximum value of V is taken as the optimal number of clusters. That means the number of this C for which this entire thing becomes maximum. That maximum means either increase this one, that means the distance between the two clusters is very high, or the inter-cluster distance is very low. So that means if the denominator is low or the numerator is high, the entire thing will go high. So the objective is to maximize V so as to get the optimum number of clusters. Rather, if you just turn it around, the number of cluster C, the value of cluster C, which will maximize V, is taken as the optimal number of clusters. So you see, ultimately, either you increase the inter-cluster distance in the numerator or decrease the intra-cluster distance in the denominator. Another is Davis-Baldwin index, DB index, or oftentimes also this is type of formulation. Again, the same thing. You are taking the individual clusters and taking the distances. And distance, it has a reverse. You see reverse, since it is reverse, because here you have the distance between the two different clusters. Inter-cluster distance is in the denominator, and the intra-cluster distance factors are in the numerator. So what you do, that means you have to minimize this one in the numerator and maximize this one. That means ultimately the entire thing has to be minimized. This is what is written over here. The value of C, which will minimize dV, is referred to as the optimal number of clusters. The same approach, but the reverse mathematical formulation. That means maximizing V is equal to maximizing Dunn index, similar to minimizing dV index. Another is CLOT coefficient. CLOT, you know, this word is quite known. CLOT is something which is a shadow which comes out from the light in the street light. Because you know, in the street light, if you see the street lights are actually just focused onto the road and not directly to the direction of traveling. Because if that is so the drivers will be ultimately the drivers will be distracted by the glare of the light. So that is referred to as CLOT, because the portion of the position what I mean to say, what the street light is there, it's only illuminated. Other parts are not illuminated. But then based on that light, you get some illumination apart from the region. Outside the region also you get some light. It is also referred to as CLOT lighting. That is CLOT actually. So based on that, this coefficient has come up. So what you do over here, what you do over there, you just do again the same thing approach, calculate what is the average distance of the one single point to the points in each cluster. That means take a cluster, different points are there, you take one single point and you calculate the distance, average distance of this particular point with all the other points. And then B, minimum of the average distance of I to points in another cluster. That means another cluster also is there where other points are there. So you also take the distance between this point to all other points in another cluster and try to just take the minimum of that. So obviously you just go for this calculation B minus A by max AB. And here the closer it is equal to 1. So actually speaking, you are just normalizing the entire equation by dividing by max of A and B. Some sort of normalization procedure to make it between 0 and 1. So if it goes, the more the value is closer to 1, the better is the outcome. Better is the cluster. So the value of C for which this particular CLOT index is maximized. That means if it moves towards 1, that means it is maximized. So it is the best optimum cluster. And negative values may also come in depending on the situation. These are pathological means these are not taken into account. These are some reference values actually, which may come in to indicate that clustering is actually invalid. Anyway, and the last one we'll be discussing I index, very popular index. So here the formulation is like this, where also you are using the same thing in some different form, intra-cluster distance EJ. So it is in the denominator, okay. And U1 is a constant value. So here you do not have anything which is dependent on the inter-cluster distance. Only purely based on the intra-cluster distance you calculate the index. Okay, the optimal number is obtained by maximizing IK. So obviously speaking, intra-cluster distance is in the denominator. So you always would like to just discuss about the different indices. Now, also we have just discussed why these concepts we have just discussed prior to these are actually required for building up the concept, because these indices will ultimately be used for as the objective functions. Okay, either of these, whichever you feel like. Now coming to the actual topic, because I will not be discussing anything about the introduction to quantum computer or quantum computing. You know all these things very well because already 3 days have been passed by. So given that you know the concept of qubits and all these things and the different features of quantum computing, or like the superposition, entanglement, and then coherence, decoherence, measurement, all these things you know, I suppose. Then given the information, what is the main objective of having or how to design a quantum materialistics? Now the basic thing is that this term is misnomer. Misnomer in the sense you cannot have any pure quantum materialistics, because we already discussed that materialistics are iterative processes and you cannot have a quantum version at all as of now, because it is quite difficult to just enact them or implement them on a quantum hardware. So what is the way out? Actually is a quantum inspired materialistics. Materialistics inspired by the features of quantum principles of quantum mechanics. Anyway, so the main thing is that, because you know in any materialistic you first start with a string of populations. That means you encode the population, either a binary encoding or a real encoding, all these things. So encoding if it's fast, then you go for some different operations or the selection, then evolution of fitness, selection, then operations, different recombination operations and mutation, diversity. So reducing diversity, selection, then increasing diversity, and then you have a new offsprings and all these things, and replenish the population, discard the worst solutions, and replace them with the new offsprings, with the hope that new offsprings are going to have better fitness, and then you start all over again. So if you just follow each and every step, there are different steps over there. So you start with the first step, how to encode the solution, because in the quantum domain, all you do not have these actual numbers or something like that. You only have to deal with qubits. If at all in the near future we'll be having these algorithms be implemented on real quantum hardware, you will require to just encode the entire solution using qubits. So what you see, some example is there. You can just, one simple example, you can do it any other way. So it is a chromosome, you see, it is a chromosome, or the entire chromosome is there, but the individual genes are actually some qubits, alpha 1 and beta 1. So actually speaking, it is a Psi function. If you just write it as Psi, so you know that is alpha 0 plus beta 1. Okay, fine. So actually, it can also it can be represented in various forms. You can also represent the Psi as, Psi should be like this. Psi as, it can be represented only as a vector of alpha and beta, isn't it? That will be sufficient. You do not need to include the basis states in the notation, only the alpha. So actually alpha and beta are actually doing the tricks. So let us suppose that the Psi 1 is the first qubit. So you would take Psi alpha 1 beta 1 for that. The first qubit forms the first part, then the second qubit, then the third qubit. In this way you go to how many number of classes you require, maybe p. You do not know the value of p. Let us suppose you take a number, say 20 or 30, whatever. You look at a huge number, because you do not know how many number of clusters you are going to have. So you just frame a string with different qubits and encode them like this. Now the problem is that, or the problem of the advantage or disadvantage is that, first of all, in the case of classical strings or classical chromosome, you need only one single bit to represent information. But here you require 2 bits, 2 positions, actually, 2 qubits, not 2 qubits actually, two values to represent the qubit. So the string length becomes double. Fine, that is fine, that can be taken. But then the advantage is that why actually you are using qubits? The advantage comes in because you have some sort of parallelism in the case of qubit. Now the beauty is that during manipulation of these qubits, alpha and beta or the basis states, a time will come, that means during random manipulation, either alpha will go up, beta will go down, or beta will go up and alpha will go down with the condition that alpha square plus beta square will always be equal to 1. Based on the unitarity condition, alpha square plus beta square always will be equal to 1. But in either way, within this, alpha may go up and beta may go down. If alpha goes up, beta will go down. If alpha goes down, beta will go up to maintain this unitarity fair condition. So that is the advantage. You do not know what is going to happen during the entire process. You take both alpha and beta 1. Now during the entire process, you have the option that either alpha 1 out of alpha 1 beta 1, or beta 2 out of alpha 2 beta 2, or alpha 3 out of beta 3 alpha 3 beta 3, or anyone. That means either of them may go up and go down. So that is the problem. That is the catch. How does actually go up and go? Because I don't know, because that is the main issue, because I know whether I suppose that you know all these things, how these are manipulated. So alpha 1 beta 1, once it goes up, that means if alpha 1 goes up, that means you are near to the solution, because alpha 1 goes up means what? If you take the Bloch's pair, sorry, I'll be not taking the interspace, this Bloch's pair, if you just look at this, actually alpha beta or any particular qubit is a vector like this, which is angle theta like this, okay, with a length r. So r cos theta and r sin theta, this is the sin theta part. So if you take a unit vector r is equal to 1, it becomes a qubit with a unit vector like that. So your objective is to rotate it, either move it towards this 0, that is the 0 basis state, or 1 basis state, or in this direction. You do not know. That means either you move it here or there. That manipulation takes place on this particular qubit to move it closer to 0 or 1. So that what actually happens. So if you move towards 0, that means alpha is getting higher and beta is getting lower. And similarly, if it moves in this direction, beta is getting higher and alpha is getting lower. So that means you have the advantage that only one parameter, either alpha or beta, will ultimately decide whether it is going to reach the 0 basis state, reach nearer to the 0 basis state, or 1 basis state. So now, since one parameter is sufficient enough to just decide the movement of this particular qubit in either direction, so you are getting the solution very easily, because when you just find that alpha has become appreciably higher compared to beta, and beta is appreciably low, you just make a measurement and you get a zero output. That means, what I mean to say, that means you have the options, but you do not know previously which one, whether alpha or beta will go on increasing or not. That is why you have to take both of them together, just doubling the entire string length. But then, with the option that you can manipulate the qubit by both using alpha and beta, and anyone which is helping you to reach the nearest basis state will help you to reach the optimal solution in no time. That is why making it faster. Okay. I suppose you have got my point. So but then you have to do not know. Since you do not know, you take both of them together, because in this situation it may happen that alpha 1 is higher and beta 1 is low. But in the second situation, it may happen beta 1 is higher, beta 1 is going high, and alpha is going low. So you have to take both of them. Now, given that you have encoded the string like this with using qubits, now what is the objective? Objective is to just find out the optimal number of clusters. That means you have to not give the input of clusters from outside. You are only going to find out the optimal number of clusters. So what we do generally, you can just, based on the alpha and beta, or based on the individual qubits, you can assign a threshold like this, phi 1, phi 2, phi 3. For each and every individual gene, you can just put some threshold over here. So what threshold is? Now, threshold is heuristic in nature, because actually speaking, either alpha or beta will either go to 0 or go to 1 finally after measurement. So any value in between 0.5 will be maybe the threshold, right threshold. For the time being, let us suppose that it is uniform thresholding. So you take phi 1, phi 2, phi 3, phi 4. All these are random in nature, but nearer to between 0 and 1. Now, so these are the cluster centroids actually, isn't it? These are the cluster centroids. So different, you just assume that the 20 number of clusters, so each and every 20 number of clusters mean 20 cluster centers are there. And for each and every cluster center, you also define some activation threshold. Now, during the entire process, what you do, you just check on these activation thresholds and see whether this activation threshold is greater than 0.5 or not. Once it goes greater than 0.5, that means this particular cluster, alpha 1, beta 1, is an active cluster. And if the threshold is coming below 0.5, that means this cluster is at all not needed. It is an inactive cluster. That means by the entire process, the process is to find out the active clusters and the inactive clusters. So ultimately, at the end of some iterations or generations, you will get, that means that number 20 will go on getting reduced. So if this is inactive, what you do based on some parameters, you merge it to this one. You merge this cluster to this cluster. So ultimately, you get one cluster removed. So this becomes a active cluster, and then again maybe this one, the fourth one may also get active, and this may get deactivated. So you merge them together based on the distance. So you see, out of 4 you are getting 2. So you are reducing these 20 downwards. So ultimately, with the end of the number of generations, or then depending on the stopping criteria, will reach out to some reduced or the optimum number of clusters, which is far less than 20 and appropriate, based on the validity index, because each and every time you get a number of clusters. For example, in the first run, out of the first run, if these 2 clusters are merged and these 2 clusters are merged, so ultimately how many are get reduced? 2 get reduced. So you come up with the value of 18. So once you come up with the value of 18, and let us suppose all others are active, remain active. So 18. So if you put taking 18, what you do now, you cluster the entire data set now. You have got this cluster using this cluster centroids. And once you get the cluster the entire data set, then what you do, you calculate the cluster validity index. Either you take a DV index or a DUN index, and to see what the value is coming up. For the case of DUN index, if the value is very closer to 0, then it is very good solution. Then you go over again. So that is the fitness function over here, DV. So how this string is going to fit into the solution. So in this way, you go on continuing until you reach at the optimal solution. So that all about the quantum part, the encoding is already done. Now let us move forward. Now see some typical algorithms I put forward, obviously from my publications or my scholars publication. I'll be just discussing 2 algorithms. That is why I've taken only 2 algorithms, because it is very huge thing to cover up. Now this is referred to as quantum inspired automatic clustering, AC, PSO, particle sum optimization. So this algorithm is a quantum inspired version of the particle sum optimization algorithm for automatic clustering. So you see what are the steps. Sorry. Obviously, these are quite common: input, number of generations, population size, accretion coefficients, inertia weight, optimal number of clusters is output. Initially, what you do, a population P, n number of particles, this is population size n, is generated by picking pixel intensity values randomly, because random solution from the entire image, and all these things are quite known to all of you, how the length is determined. Now, using an encoding scheme, each element in P is encoded to a real value between 0 and 1. For ultimately, you are going to convert it into quantum qubits. Let it create P plus. So ultimately, after this part, you are getting alpha and beta. That means each and every individual bit of the solution has been converted to alpha and beta, or rather to a qubit. Then you pass the P plus to a quantum orthogonality. That means to ensure that the alpha and beta which have been created in the previous step randomly, they follow this unitarity condition: alpha square plus beta square is equal to 1. We ensure that. That means now the qubit is now foolproof. This particular makes it the qubit solution is foolproof now. So then what you do, you go for some normalization operations, and then this is the entire procedure. Random number of cluster centers. You just choose random number of cluster centers randomly activated for each particle. Okay, those previous one, randomly activated party, randomly choose the 5-1, 5-2, 5-3, etc. And then what you do, for each particle you go on. For each particle you assign the data points, each and every one to the active cluster centers. Then you ultimately what you get a cluster output. Then what you do, measure the quality of clustering for the elements in clustered output CR using a cluster validity measure as objective function, either DV or DUN or CLOT or I index. And then record this index value and the number of clusters obtained. So this index value will determine whether your clustering is good or not. and for which number of cluster you are getting the good that particular value. You record that and you store that for future use. And then you update the velocity and position of each and every particle and repeat everything all over again. And each and every time you compare your present value with the previous value. And then you go all over, like the entire process, entire algorithm is run for a certain different number of times, and the final outcome gives you the optimum number of clusters which will ultimately maximize or minimize a particular objective function depending on the objective function you are using. So this is the entire procedure. Okay. If you just go for the differential evolution part, differential evolution, it is quantum inspired differential evolution for automatic clustering. Similar type of operation, same thing, but here you require the crossover probability because you have the crossover operation over here. The scaling factor is already there in the differential evolution. Population size is there, number of generation G is there. And ultimately, you get optimal number of clusters, eta. The first steps are identical, encoding steps are identical. And then what you do, you just go on for this quantum mutation part. You apply the quantum mutation, then apply the quantum crossover, and then what you do, you decide the quantum crossover part, because for random quantum, you just choose a quantum crossover probability, and for a random number, you know it better because you know genetically. Same thing is repeated over, but on the quantum, on the qubits, not on the classical, because all these things are done in the quantum domain. And finally, each and every after all these things are done, you just repeat the steps to ensure quantum orthogonality. And midway between, what you do, the same thing is done over here. You just get some active and inactive clusters, and then you just cluster the entire data using your current active clusters. Then what you do, you measure the validity, quality, etc., all these things to find out the validity of the clusters, record the index and all these things, and move all over again. So finally, you get the optimum number of clusters tau and the corresponding fitness value. So these algorithms actually are similar to the classical algorithm, with the exception that the encoding part is different, the operator parts are different. Now the interesting thing is that means when you are doing all these things together, the advantage you are getting is that you are manipulating both alpha and beta together. Okay, alpha and beta together, that is helping you to decide to reach the optimum solution in the least time possible, because both the alpha and beta will ultimately control your algorithm, and the higher a particular value of alpha or beta will ultimately ensure that this is reaching the optimum. But in the classical case, it is quite difficult because you do not have any option to monitor that, because there are only values, classical values only, whether it is going up. But until and unless you calculate the fitness value, you cannot know whether this is going to be the fittest solution. But in this case, you can manipulate alpha and beta independently, and the trend in which alpha and beta is moving, whether it is increasing or decreasing, that will decide. That can help you to convert the algorithm, or to help the algorithm converge in lesser time compared to the classical paradigms. Now we are giving some results. Now, so we have just given the two algorithms, QASC-PSO and QASC-PE, and they have been compared together based on the following criteria. First, the quality of the solution using DV index. We have used DV index. That is the Davis-Baldwin index. Okay. And accuracy and stability of each of the techniques, how it is accurate and how it is stable. Stable means how does it converge, whether the convergence is faster or not, and statistical superiority test and PRT test. Just also compare them with statistical test. Standard error you have taken, standard error, and the computational time taken. So based on all these factors, you can compare the algorithm. Maybe other measures you can also take. Maybe another thing which you can also compute, because it's the diversity in the solution. You can also, because when you just go for the quantum mutation, quantum crossover, how much diversity is coming out? What is the nature of diversity you are getting in the solution? Whether it is better than in the classical case, that is also maybe one of the parameters for comparing the two algorithms. So you see, now we actually speaking, we have compared these, not only the quantum version, but also with the classical ones. You see, this one with classical one, this one with the classical one. So taken these 4 standard images from the Barclay data set, and these are some of the parameter settings which have been used for the QASC-PSO, and both the classical and the quantum, and the classical and the number of generations you have taken, population size, the scaling factor, crossover probability. Here also different parameters have been chosen accordingly. And then you see some results, quite astonishing results for the QIACPSO, the classical one, QIACD, the classical one. So all the images, tools, Oman, B2, both, just 4 images for this QIACPSO. These are the optimal number of clusters you are getting for different runs. For the Oman, these are the optimal number of clusters you are getting with the different runs. For the B2, this is the optimal number of clusters. For the board, this is the optimal number of clusters. Similarly, for SEO, you are getting this one, this one, this one, this one. For the QIACDE, you are getting this one, this one, this one, this one. And for the SEDE, you are getting this one, this one, this one, this one. Now, fine, that these are only numbers, isn't it? Now, how can you judge whether which one is giving you the best result? So after 5 runs, I have only just given for the sake of due to the scarcity of space, only 5 results, 5 runs have been shown. So then you go for some statistical comparison test, looking the mean and the standard deviation, how these things are built up. You will see that in the case of QIACPSO, the mean is like this. For the tools, you get the mean. Mean and the standard deviation is very low compared to others. Compared to others, standard deviation is low. This is comparable to this, but then the mean is like this, mean is like this, mean is like this, mean is like this. So this is something which is near about this particular figure. For the Oman also, you see the standard deviation. So these values actually give you the statistical analysis of the data of the result. That is the eta C, and it is the optimal number of clusters coming out of the 4 algorithms. Now then, finally, to establish the supremacy of one particular algorithm over the other, it is the errors we have obtained, standard error for the different algorithms, standard error for the different images as well. Then you go for the unpaired t-test with a p-value, taking a p-value, and then you found out that this, you see for the ranking, if you go for ranking, A is, now you compare A with B, that means taking 2 algorithms at once. A is QIACPSO and B is SCPSO. Comparing the quantum with the classical. Then quantum PSO with the quantum ACD. Quantum PSO with the classical ACD. Classical PSO with the quantum, this will be D, sir. Sorry, this will be D. So in this all 2 algorithms taking 2 at once, we are comparing that. Okay. And finally, what you have done, you have done the Friedman test, which will allow you to compare all the n number of algorithms together. So what you do for the different tests, you see you have compared this one, this one, this one, this one. You see the ranking for the QIACPSO is the lowest. The lower the rank, the better is the algorithm. So ultimately, it is established that QIACPSO is having the best performance over these algorithms. Now, mind you, it is not always so, because this is only giving the best performance as far as this particular problem of automatic clustering is concerned. If you just go for applying these algorithms to any other problem, it may happen that other algorithm can come out to be superior. So that is the main problem with any evolutionary algorithm. There is no universal algorithm or no universal solution. Okay, and that is why it is referred to as no free lunch theorem. So that is always, that means each and every day you see people are coming up with new algorithms. That is why there is no end to this, because there is no universal algorithm which can play universally or it can perform universally in all the problems. So it depends on the problem also and depends on the algorithm also. And this is a typical comparison times. So you see the comparison time, the computational time for the QIACPSO is still lower than compared to others. So in the classical case, it has been found that classical PSO has been found to be superior for a wide variety of problems. And then that is establishing that it is a very good algorithm. And in this case also, we have seen that QIACPSO also is having the better performance because it is also inheriting some properties from the classical PSO. Maybe it is in the quantum domain. Now, these are some readings or references. If you feel interested, I'll be sharing the slide as well. You can just go through these references, and also it's a huge number of work, huge amount of work is there in the literature, is there in the internet. You can just consult it. And finally, always we try to just publicize ourselves. This one book, Morgan Koppmann. Way back in 2013, we came up with this book. So this is between you see, this is myself, Ujjwal Maulik and Paramatma Ratto. He's going to be the next speaker over here. So we came up with this particular book. It is quite interesting, and also several books have also come up. But then we generally try to promote the books for the sake of your knowledge.
One question
Yeah, yes, yes.
from one of the participants. Could you explain again hard and soft clustering?
Hard and soft clustering. I told you hard and soft cluster. Hard clustering is a very strict form of interpretation. That means only if you just go for different data points, it is always taken that one data point, once it belongs to a one cluster, depending on some features, it will not belong to another cluster. Strictly contained in one single cluster. There is no possibility that that point can be thought of to be a point, to be a part of another cluster. Hard clustering. That means the boundary is defined, well defined. But in the case of soft clustering, there is, I told you with an example of the sneakers. Sneakers, you buy sneakers from the market. Sneakers can classified into both a sports shoe and as well as an apparel. So you cannot just strictly confine it within a sports apparel, telling that sneakers is always a sports apparel. Sports apparel. But then it also a shoe. In fact, apart from the sportsman, we are not the sportsman also wear sneakers. So it is not that if you wear sneakers, will be a sportsman and vice versa. So that particular case, you see very typical case where the sneakers have some such features which makes it suitable for being qualifying for both the clusters, both as a sports apparel and as also a shoe. That is not possible in the case of hard clustering. So in the sneakers, so that means maybe the sneakers are well suited for the sportsman. It is likely to be qualified as a sports apparel more appropriately compared to that being a shoe. But then the sneakers are all actually it's a very highly costly or costly shoes. So only very few people can afford. But then that means what you can do in the case if you just try to cluster it out using soft clustering technique, it will be contained in that cluster of soft sports apparel with a very high membership value. And but with and also in the shoe cluster with a very low membership value, because very few people may wear that sneaker outside the ambit of the sportsman, but the sportsman essentially wear sneakers. But it is always true that not all sportsmen will always wear sneakers. Maybe other sportsmen may be using other types of shoes also as well. So there is always a possibility that it cannot be directly said or strictly said that the sneakers are essentially or strictly sports apparel and nothing else.
Let me thank you, sir, for your valuable time you have shared with us and delivered an exceptional topic in quantum meta heuristic. I hope it's a real a topic the participants can work with and do their research. Thank you very much, sir, and we'll look forward for your next lecture tomorrow at 12 o'clock.
Thank you very much. Okay.